5 years. 5 years of torment. 5 years of the most confusing, dumbest, or aggravating boss fights in all of gaming. And yet this idiot doesn't know when to quit. Well, if he's stupid enough to keep at it, then I'll keep slinging shit his way. It's another round of crappy bosses and some ghost stories thrown in for good measure to tie it all in with the season. You ready? Let's just hope he is.
One of the most popular set pieces for ghosts, hauntings, and the paranormal in general are without a doubt castles. Usually dating back multiple centuries mixed in with that old Gothic design, they are essentially time portals to the Middle Ages, and mixed in with humanity's twisted, demented, and cruel history. It's easy to see why castles are ripe for stories of hauntings and ghost stories. That'll attract many visitors and tourists for a chance to experience the phenomenon themselves. Now, while you may need to book a visit to Castle Ep in Couldry, Ireland, it may be worth the wait after hear about the entities who supposedly haunt these castle halls. Guessed to have been originally built in the 13th century. One of the structure's more notorious events happened during the 15th century where a man killed his brother who was a priest while he was holding mass, in which would quickly lead to it being dubbed the Bloody Chapel. But other grim facts include poor souls being imprisoned, tortured, and executed here, which a lot have happened here, as in the 1920s where the castle was seeing restoration work. 3 cartloads of human bones would be uncovered from the dungeon. There are also tales of a poor girl named Emily who sadly fell off the tower in the 1600s. Ever since, there's been sightings of an apparition of the soul, forever reenacting her fatal drop. There's also bizarre sightings of a decaying sheep-like spirit that gives off a scent of sulfur. But possibly the most famous spirit that haunts the castle is known as the Red Lady, who is known to be carrying what looks like a dagger, ready to stab an unseen being. So very far back I did an episode on the Sonic Advance trilogy, and due to having Sonic Advance 2 the longest growing up, I probably spent the most amount of time talking about that game, and for good reason. While it definitely leans as far as it possibly can on the speed category without it going into the boost gameplay, I still feel it's the best out of the trilogy. Nonetheless though, it's not a perfect game by any means, and when it does trip over itself a couple times, it'll faceplant pretty hard, like getting to those special stages. Ugh. Another aspect some people feel this game falters on is the bosses, due to most of them being similar thanks to being forced to continuously keep on running. While I get that sentiment, I personally don't mind it. Sure, it's a gimmick, but I can appreciate that the team wanted to keep that high sense of speed like the rest of the game was going for. In fact, I'd probably compliment on the team finding ways to make each boss do something different despite being forced into the running situation each time. But of course, I wouldn't be talking about this game if they were all pretty solid, and I think anyone who's played this game knows which one I'm talking about. The Egg Saucer. For many, this is considered the hardest fight in the game due to the laser shooting a nearly invisible beam, which, to be honest, never gave me too much of a problem, even on that original little screen. Yeah, no, the big hand is what gives this boss its infamy. So, what's the problem? Doesn't look like it has too much range, and it only gets trickier if you take out the laser beam, which makes it a bit more erratic. If anything, it seems like it'd be a decent challenge, and you know what? It probably would have been one of the better bosses. But, well... yeah, that. That just goes against the very principle of what any longtime Sonic fan should know. As long as you have rings, you're safe from getting hit. I didn't fall into a bottomless pit, drown, or get crushed. I got hit. With rings, mind you, and the kicker is, it's completely random when the game decides whether it's an instant kill or not. Sometimes I'm safe from the slap attack, and other times I'm ready to throw my fucking controller. I'll never understand why they did this. I mean, come on, like the final boss doesn't even do that, for Christ's sakes. Is it the worst thing I've ever had to deal with in a video game? No. Is it even that hard to work around with patience? No, in fact, you should only fall for it once, and after that, it's just bad luck on your part. Hell, compared to all the bosses I've picked over the years for this little mini-series, it's far from the worst. But when shit like that happens, it's aggravating, especially since you just finished getting past the worst zone in the game. And anytime it happens, it makes me want to stop playing, or just skip to the next stage and level select. And when a player gets that feeling, well, you done goofed. Probably the most famous castle in France is the Château de Brézac, considered to be the region's most beloved structure. With its unique design, it's not hard to see why. But with anything this old, it's destined to hold some dark secrets, and possibly the most famous gruesome event is that of the death of Charlotte de Brézac, killed by her husband Jacques after catching her in an affair with another. Rumored has it that this act of vengeance would soon come back to haunt him. Literally, as he would soon move from the castle after killing her, due to being plagued by the constant wailing of her ghost that now haunted the castle. Ever since then, Charlotte has been nicknamed the Green Lady due to her dress, and she has been reported to float throughout the castle, frightening guests with her high-pitched screams, or with her appearance of anyone who gets close enough to see a mutilated corpse-like face with large gaping holes where her eyes should be. It feels like forever since I last talked about this game. South Park as a series is something I hold close to my heart, especially this game. I know out of the original trilogy, this is technically the worst one despite being the most ambitious, but it's a guilty pleasure for me for more reasons than one. I'll reiterate it every time I talk about the very first South Park game, but it's just so unreal to think that this series' gaming debut was a first-person shooter that ran on the Turok engine. And what fascinates me even more is how close they got the controls to feel good for an N64 controller. If it wasn't as loose or finicky to control the reticle, or even added the option for an aiming assist like GoldenEye did, then I feel like this game would have held up a hell of a lot better. Sure, it wouldn't have been a masterpiece since there's a lot of problems with this game, but it was pretty close. Now, that's not to say this game is a complete dumpster fire, as there are some things I genuinely feel this game did pretty good with. One of those things was the enemies you faced off against. Well, for the most part. South Park had 5 episodes broken up to 3 or 4 chapters each, with each episode focused on a specific threat. Turkeys in episode 1, clones in 2, aliens 3, so on and so forth. And they were generally separated into 3 categories. Mooks, tanks which were basically mini-bosses, and then a boss at the end of each chapter. And when it came to the bosses, I will give this game a bit of credit in terms of creativity, and for the most part, they are pretty fun encounters. You can never go wrong with a giant turkey having a literal bullseye on its butt, or having to face off against Mr. Hat in this TV robot army, each providing something a little bit different and usually being a decent challenge. In Chapter 5, this seemed to be shaping up just like the rest. Here you face off against killer toys, which cool in concept, but a pain in the fucking ass to deal with in practice due to their quick little moving bodies, and the game's pretty lackluster aiming. But the tanks, surprisingly, they weren't too bad, so that gave me a little hope that the final boss would be just as good, and hey, you know what? If it wasn't for one glaring flaw, I would say it would have been one of the better boss fights in the game. Ultra Mega Mega Man, a nice little reference to the episode Damien, is a hulking action figure where his 2 weak spots is either his head or the battery pack on his back. While he isn't quick, he has a few attacks and generally hits pretty hard. If you've made it to this point, then chances are you'd have the skill to take the giant toy out. But once you get about half of his health down, the guy fucking beelines it back to his podium and then the unthinkable happens. His health starts to regenerate and it's like, no, just fuck you, no. I can't even do that, what the hell? Yep, that went from an okay fight, turned into probably the most aggravating part of the whole game, because if you die, you have to do that entire level over again, and 100 health points can be drained from you pretty quickly due to how many enemies there are on the way, and how frequent they attack. The main gimmick here is that there's an on and off switch for the battery charger, and you have to shoot at any time fuckface triggers this. Which, okay, kind of cool in its own way and surprisingly makes sense given the enemy you're facing. But we come back to that fickle aiming problem I was talking about earlier. It's shocking just how hard it can be to hit the switch to stop this process, and it really only stops for a set amount of time. The Mega douche is gonna try and regenerate his health whenever he possibly can, and he is faster than you once he starts the boogie. Mixed in with only a few health pickups for you, and you could be here for a really long time. So yeah, mediocre to bad game has a shitty boss, so surprising. But when boss fights are actually one of the few highlights of the game, it just makes this one gimmick that's not seen anywhere else in the game all the more jarring. We all know this game has got a bad reputation, and honestly, if you want to see the ending, then I'd say just cheat. It's not worth the aggravation to get it legitimately, in my opinion. The Musham Castle in Salzburg, Austria definitely earned its nickname the Witch's Castle for a very good reason. Built around the 13th century, Musham was a hotspot for the Salzburg witch trials in which over 100 people would be accused and killed for witchcraft. Ironically, majority of the accused were actually men. Nonetheless, no one was safe, ranging from the ages of 10 all the way up to the elderly 80s. The methods used to torture were truly horrendous. Hands would be cut off, and people were burned with hot irons, which branded them as criminals for the rest of their lives. And many would sadly confess to using witchcraft just to end their suffering. With a dark history as this, it would be shocking not to hear of any paranormal phenomenon to lurk in these halls. The current owner of the castle, Teresita Wilczek, states the room called the Room of Tony was the quarters of the man who was responsible for all the torture, and because of this, many feel a dark presence in this room. In fact, one museum visitor stated that she even conversed with this entity. In the torture chamber, many have felt hands touch their hair and legs, others state that an unseen presence came very close to them, and it's here where several people have reported that they felt someone breathing on them. There have also been various voices that have been heard much like the described room of Tony, and also many have been recorded during EVP sessions in the castle. You know, it's funny, this boss fight has been on my radar ever since probably the second or even the first iteration of this little yearly series I do, but I've always kind of shied away from it simply because I didn't want to oversaturate certain series, even though I somehow breaking that rule when it comes to Sonic and in this case Resident Evil. But hey, when you play the hell out of these specific series, more picks tend to stand out because of it, so shut up. My list. But it's funny, I knew this boss fight would end up making the list at some point, but over the years it kinda dawned on me. Most of the bosses for Resident Evil Revelations just kinda sucked in general. So screw it, let's just go big on this one and talk about them mostly as a whole and global saturate the fuck out of number 3. Now, don't get me wrong, as a game in its own right, Revelations 1 was truly impressive, especially when you remember that it was originally a 3DS exclusive. And during a time where the focus on action was at its highest, this was a breath of fresh air the series desperately needed. Part of this was definitely due to how enemies worked. It went back to that less is more approach where you only fought a few at a time, but they weren't pushovers and could take quite a few hits, with having to learn each enemy's weak point to make them stagger. That same mindset applies to the majority of the boss encounters here. There's no major patterns, no waves or segments to change things up. Just you and this being that is a hell of a lot stronger than normal enemies. And on one hand, I can compliment this. It's taken a page right from the classics. Again, outside of the final boss, there's no obvious weak spot. And even if there is, it's usually not a shoot here to win situation, and because of it, it makes these encounters a lot more interesting. But one of the key differences here is that back in the classic era, majority of these fights never overstayed their welcome. Oh my god, man, never has a game in this series glorified the term bullet sponge better than the Revelation bosses. Well, that is until Resident Evil 2 zombies hit the scene this year, but you know what I mean. Now, I understand bosses in general are supposed to be beefier encounters. That only makes too much sense. But one of the worst things you can do in my opinion is make fights feel like this is dragging on, and not changing up anything during the battle. For example, this fight right here. Sure, it can be a little tricky getting the timing down on dodging, but once you get used to this crustacean's pattern, which doesn't take long at all mind you, all it ever does is to either charge at you or does the slam attack, and after that, you're just playing the waiting game, and because of it, it's just fucking boring. Another example with this rail fight right here, same idea. Aim, shoot, repeat this for like 5 to 10 minutes. And okay, sure, that one we could chalk up to hardware limitations, but to me the best example is this very pick I was originally going to go with. The first encounter with the Skaghead. Now, to this fight's credit, it is easily the most intense fight in the game. Skagheads have a lot of health. They can shoot what are essentially bear traps to lock you in place, all in an attempt to nab you with its insta-kill attack. Mix that in with an infinite respawn of mooks from a bunch of different angles, and you're gonna feel the heat. But let's be real here. The only reason why this fight is so intense is because of the mooks getting in your way. If anything, they're the bigger threat, and more times than not, I'm dying by their claws, not Buddy's weird chainsaw hand. To me, what seals the deal a little bit is when later on when you're playing as Chris, you'll be forced to fight against 2 at once, and at first it's like, oh fuck me, this is ridiculous. But after a little bit, you soon realize that, oh, the enemy type on their own are actually pretty easy to manipulate as long as you keep your distance. And oh great, it's another time sink bullet sponge fight that lasts way too long. And once you realize that, all it does is make the original fight feel more annoying and cheap. Hodgdon Tower has had many famous guests over its time, such as William Shakespeare, Charles Dickens, and even King James I, but with its ghostly reputation, it's become more known as one of the most haunted structures in the UK. Reports of paranormal activity at Hodgdon Tower are so frequent that the staff actually maintain a special ghost file to log all the unusual occurrences that they experience, or are told by guests. Some of the ghosts that have been reported at Hodgdon Tower include a Tudor woman who walks around the courtyard, a little girl that appears in various locations around the area, a ghostly monk at the north entrance, a spirit that's believed to frequent the well house due to one of the dogs at the tower are always barking at one of the corners. And also, much like Chateau de Brisac, there are sightings of the tower's very own Green Lady who is often spotted by people taking part of tours at the house. Perhaps the next time you're in the area, give Hodgdon Tower a visit. It may be one you'll never be allowed to forget. You know, I'm probably one of the few people who wouldn't mind if we got a Super Paper Mario 2. Obviously not before a return to a normal Paper Mario game. Fuck no, that desperately needs to become a reality. We all need Paper Mario 3 in our lives, people. But I didn't mind what Super set out to do. I just feel it played a little too safe with the gameplay mechanics and the level design, but that's a story for another day. So as an action RPG, or RPG in general, the game has its fair share of bosses, and while it can never get too unique due to the platforming element, I can still give the game credit at some points in this regard. One of the traditions of Mario RPG games, even as far back as Legend of the Seven Stars, is that there would be a super secret final boss that would be the toughest challenge in the game, and they would usually outrank the official final boss. Kulex, the Master, Bonetail, for one reason or another they would test your skills and they would make you have to earn that win. And it would always be a very fulfilling feeling whenever you do achieve victory against them. Super Paper Mario is no exception to bringing back these secret final bosses. Bringing back the pit of 100 trials from the 1,000-year door, you'd be tasked with having to clear each room, all in an effort to reach the end to earn a special item. Well, Super Paper Mario decides to up the ante and include 2 pits of 100 trials this time. 100 trials for flip side and another for flop side. Something I definitely can get behind as a concept, as it's a great side activity. Flip side trials, not too bad. In my opinion, it's a little too easy, and essentially doing another version of the first boss again is a little disappointing, but hey, clearly this is just the warm-up. Flop side will surely offer something much better. And at first attempt, it definitely does. It's a hell of a lot harder, and will definitely test players much more. Be prepared to have a decent level and plenty of items, as these trials will definitely test your endurance. And possibly after a couple tries, you finally make it to the 100th floor. Or in this case, more like the 200th floor. Only to be greeted by an eye in the background and you think, oh shit, what kind of hell demon am I going up against? Then you see those horrible words. To do the first 99 floors all over again to prove that you're truly the heroes. Fuck you. This is honestly the worst thing they could have done here. I mean, like, come on, make you do this again? Why? What purpose is there to this other than padding? Simple answer, there isn't any. When you do it the second time, it's not harder by any means. No change-ups or anything like that. You're doing this again for no other reason than the developers wanting to be dicks. And then when you finally do make it to the 100th floor a second time, what does the boss entail? You fight a shadow copy of Mario, Peach, Bowser, and Luigi. Yay, who gives a flying fuck? Especially since 2 out of the 4 forms of this boss I've already fought a couple times. Whoopee fucking shit. And you know what the kicker is? Because this shadow fuck decides to make you go through the trials again, it just robbed you of whatever little challenge this fight might have had because, well, going through 198 floors of enemies leads to a lot of experience points. And more experience points means your level goes up, so more health and damage for each attack you do. Where if they left things well enough alone, you'd probably have a bit more of a challenge the first go. Ugh. I like Super Paper Mario, but this process of getting the secret final boss is such a letdown. And all you get out of it? Some fucking cards that are like basically useless to you. Outside of the Mario card letting you stay in the 3D space for as long as you want. Who gives a shit? Edinburgh is no stranger to the paranormal, considered to be the most haunted part of Scotland, and in fact some refer to it as the most haunted city in all of Europe. And at the center of it all is Edinburgh Castle. Believed to have been built as a military fortress in the early 12th century, the castle has witnessed many surprise attacks, executions, and even a brief capture by the English which led to many lives lost. Now a tourist attraction, it attracts many visitors to its hilltop, but it also attracts the many spirits that used to wander these halls, or worse, perished in them. Edinburgh is known for its many underground tunnels which the castle, as you would imagine, is linked to. When this was discovered hundreds of years ago, a piper was sent to examine and explore them. As he navigated the tunnels, he played his bagpipes so that he could be tracked by those above. Sadly, about halfway down, the sound of his pipes had stopped, and once this happened, a rescue party was sent, but there was no trace of the piper. He had simply vanished. But while his body may have vanished, his spirit still seems to live on, as reports of his bagpipes can sometimes still be heard. Much like other castles, Edinburgh has its own dungeons, and as mentioned, people would be tortured and executed for their crimes here, which has led to visitors seeing shadows, orbs, drops in temperature, and other phenomenon. Perhaps the most famous ghost to haunt this area is of a man who tried to escape by hiding in a dung barrel, with the intent of being carried out of the castle and guarantee his escape for freedom. Unfortunately for this convict, the barrel would be emptied over the rocky slopes of the castle, sending him plummeting to his death. Some visitors say his ghost tries to shove them from the battlements, and is accompanied by a strong and unpleasant smell of, well, you could imagine. It's funny what time can do for opinions and perspectives on topics as we grow and hopefully mature. Sometimes we solidify beliefs, other times we could look back and say to oneself, did I really think that? What was wrong with your head, bud? This is one of those times, and we're coming back to a bit of a revisit. Well, kind of. So way back on Crappy Bosses 1, one of my picks was the Greater Guardian fight from Eternal Darkness. A battle that made the list mainly due to feeling like the payoff for something that was being built up over the course of a couple chapters left a whole lot to be desired. It was kind of a drawn out battle that wasn't very difficult, and just annoying, particularly in one phase. And when it was all said and done, it left you kind of feeling like, that's it? Okay. Well, I'm not gonna say I don't agree with that pick anymore I made 5 years ago. I still feel that way, and while I kinda cringe at my ability to convey those points back then, I still stand by that pick. What I don't get though is why the hell did I pick the Greater Guardian over the other boss fight in the game that has the same issues but is an even worse offender? Oh yeah, we're talking about this guy for a bit. Pius Augustus, one of the playable characters in the game turned villain, he's straight up the poster boy for this cult classic. Voiced by Richard Doyle, who gave an amazing performance. Anytime he's on screen, the Centurion Warlock steals the show. He appears in multiple chapters, either playing a direct part in the chapter, or you feel his influence even when he doesn't show up. Pius is really 1/3 of the reason why this game is begging for a remake or sequel. He's devilishly evil and completely revels in it. And here I am talking about the Greater Guardian getting a huge build-up. This guy gets the entire game to build him up where you know you're going to be facing off against this guy at some point. Shown to be sadistic and manipulative, not afraid to get his hands dirty, 2 millennia's worth of blood on his hands actually. Oh yeah, technically a Nintendo published character by the way. He's shown to use a wide variety of magic, can even summon 9-point spells, something players can only dream of doing in this game, instead of relying on an entire forgotten underground city to use the 9-point spells. From the very beginning it's made clear, he is going to be your greatest challenge. The man has been plotting for 2,000 years and he'll stop at nothing to see his plan through and summon his ancient master into this world. Yet as far as final bosses go, Pius is probably one of the weakest I've ever had to fight. Pretty much every criticism I brought up with the Greater Guardian, you could apply to this fight tenfold, yet in a way somehow feels lesser. First off, I gotta give some credit where credit is due. While all three versions of the Greater Guardian fight are extremely similar, there are different gimmicks to make each of them stand out a little bit more. Pius doesn't get that luxury. He's gonna use the same couple attacks each and every time, and the only difference is what color the energy bolts are and how much they affect your health and sanity if he does land a hit. Which, as long as you keep moving, it's not too often you'll land those hits. Cause sadly he doesn't ever run, teleport, nothing to try and close the gap on you. So essentially it becomes a game of ring around the rosy trying to hit his ancient artifact that teleports all over the place until it breaks. I used to give this fight a break due to it going for a more cinematic take than treating it as a purely final epic boss fight, cause to its credit, it does try its damnedest to feel epic from a storytelling perspective, which I can't deny. Eternal Darkness from beginning to end had more of a focus on its story and lore building than it ever did gameplay. I mean, hell, the secret OP weapon that you can get for Alex is really only used for this fight, since it's not like she's facing many enemies in her chapter. Hell, even back in my review when I was singing his praises, I was still mocking this fight a bit. Like, honestly, it's kinda gross how much this weapon breaks this fight. So much so that I don't even recommend using it, despite the hoops you gotta jump through to get it. But that's the thing, sure, for the first time it's pretty cool and epic to see two ancient Cthulhu-like beings rip each other apart, all the while the spirits who fell to the darkness from Pius' actions get that final chance to stick it to the bastard. It's a bit of a feel-good moment, but when you strip that story element away, what are you left with? A boss fight that is completely outperformed by the one and only other fight in this game. That's not a good look for the last thing you're ever gonna fight in this entire game. And it hurts so much more knowing that it's Pius Augustus. Easily the best part about this game after the sanity effects. And just to get the shaft like that, ugh, this game did you dirty, pal. I love this game so much. I've played and completed it more times than I could ever remember, and will always recommend that anyone should play it at least once just to experience what this game was all about. But with each playthrough, those little cracks become much more noticeable, and there's just no way I could ever say that Pius had the better fight over the Greater Guardian. He just doesn't, and that's a big no-no. Not every boss battle in a video game has to be a winner, but one of the worst things you can do is drop the ball on the final act. And for a game that builds and hypes up the end as much as Eternal Darkness does throughout its story, it just makes that fumble all the more jarring, honestly.